This is the session called The Diaconate, Serving Christ in Ways the World Needs. Speakers are Deaconess Lisa Polito and Deaconess Deb Lennox. So, welcome. Thanks for being here. Our session today is going to talk a little bit about the history of the diaconate, so how we got deaconesses and deacons back all the way from Scripture to modern times. And then we're just going to tell a bunch of stories about ministry, people from our community particularly that serve in different roles. But again, how the diaconate is really in a unique position, especially now with the way churches are changing, whether we like that or not, they are, and how deaconesses and deacons really are kind of uniquely positioned to be able to be that nimble person back and forth on the margins. So I am Deaconess Deb Lennox. I am one of the co-directors of education and formation at the Lutheran Diaconal Association, which is based in Valparaiso, Indiana. And I actually work remotely. I live in New York and travel back and forth to the office as needed, and work with a bunch of our distance students. And I will let Lisa introduce herself, but we're going to tag team here in some conversation.
So I'll also say we didn't practice the fact that we would be sharing a microphone. So if it's a little awkward, sorry about that. So my name's Lisa Polito, as Deb said, and I serve as the executive director of the LDA. I was consecrated in 1990 and served 10 and a half years in Southern California before coming back to Valparaiso to serve on the LDA staff.
Why don't I do the clicker?
Okay, you clicker. So one of the things we wanted to see is, are people familiar with deaconesses or deacons who are here? Oh, please come in. Do you want to go and see if, oh, nope, she's wandering away. Does anybody know a deaconess or a deacon? And does anybody want to share who they might know, or who was the first one you knew? Or in the Bible or wherever?
In our church.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Do you know any deaconesses, ma'am?
Yeah, I know them, and I think I would share Betty Roush. Would be one of them.
Awesome, awesome.
She just had her 60th anniversary.
Yes,
And
yes,
she served in Nigeria for 35 years.
yes. Betty is just an awesome deaconess when I think about all the years she was in Nigeria and just who she is as a person, and really came back to the United States and didn't return to Nigeria because she was caring for her son. So who knows how long she would have stayed in Nigeria.
I know Sally Hiller.
Sally Hiller, yeah. Yeah, Sally Hiller serves on the Southeastern District staff. So, yeah. Awesome.
I would say, well, I know myself, and I'm
That's true. I was kind of thinking that's what you were going to say. Yes. Shirley is also one of our deaconesses. Yes, indeed. The word deaconess or deacon derives from the Greek, and in Scripture it's used in several different ways. It can, and it's not a gendered. I don't know if anybody has taken Greek. I have not, but it is not a gendered, like we would say, a woman or a man. But in Greek, a word cannot have that connotation. So it can be either masculine or feminine when it's used in Scripture. So when we see that word, and we'll see in a few minutes, two different uses of that, referring to either a female deaconess or a male deacon. But this is the biblical definition from the Bible dictionary, and it's someone who carries out the commands of another person, or a servant, which is what we would use most frequently in the context of diaconal ministry. It's a servant. So again, taking the example of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. One who, by virtue of the office assigned by the church, cares for the poor, has charge of and distributes the money collected for their use, or a servant at a table. And we talk about, in our community, we talk about images of diaconia. So what kinds of roles do people serve? And these go along with that. So we talk about someone that serves at table, someone that provides hospitality. We talk about someone that carries kind of is a go-between, so a doorkeeper, somebody that can serve both as perhaps the leader, but then also the helper, and is that bridge between the church and the world. So lots of different roles. So I've got to get this coordinated because I have to turn this and this. Ha, got it. So probably this is a familiar story. In Acts, we hear about once the apostles were, after Jesus, of course, had been crucified and resurrected, and the church is growing, the apostles got together and they said, oh my gosh, there's all this going on. And we had people grumbling because their widows weren't getting a distribution of food. It was some administrative concerns. So the apostles got together and formed the group of, they chose 7 men. So again, that's where you would get the deacon idea, to serve as kind of administrators of that food distribution and some other things in the church, so it could free up the apostles to continue to do the evangelism work that they were doing. That's the first example in Scripture. I know this is too many moving parts here. Second, of course, probably also familiar in Romans, the letter from Paul. He talks about Phoebe, and he, in this translation, in the NRSV, it uses the word deacon. In the NIV, it'll use the word deaconess, but again, they're interchangeable as far as that Greek word goes. And apparently she was, again, Paul's representative. So she was bringing information to the church in Rome. She was speaking for him, probably had a house church in her community that perhaps she was a leader of. We don't know exactly what her role was there, but sort of that go-between, that representative for someone that is doing some other work. And then when we get to the early church, so post-biblical time, Clement of Alexandria talks about deaconesses and his work. So you can see when he was around, between 150 and 215, and he says, so co-ministers in dealing with women in their homes. So again, the need was for someone to be able to go into women's homes, educate them for baptism, tell them the gospel, perhaps tend to people who were sick, and it was just not a role that the men, it wasn't appropriate for a man perhaps to do. So apparently diaconal ministry was going on early church and beyond. So some of the roles that we see, again, in the early church from historical documents, as I said, baptism. So in those days, baptism was total immersion. So if you can imagine, a modesty issue with perhaps a woman being dunked and having, maybe not a lot of clothing on or something. So the deaconesses would be those that would go into the homes and teach, but then also assist in the baptism. So there was no hint of impropriety. Pastoral care in the sense of, again, going to visit the sick, caring for emotional and spiritual needs, people in prison. When the Christians were starting to be persecuted under Roman rule, that was, again, the role of a lot of the deaconesses and deacons to sort of be that connection for people, like here's the secret meeting in the catacombs, or here's where this is happening. So again, that go-between idea. As I said, teaching women the basics of the faith, so evangelizing and catechizing those women. Again, improper for a man to be alone in a house with a woman at that time. So that was not their wife. So the deaconesses would go in and do that. And again, nursing and caregiving. So those are the traditional roles of deaconesses, and we'll see that throughout most of history until we get to sort of the 1900s time when those roles started shifting a little bit. All right, so we're going to take huge swaths of history in a moment here. So if we think of 12th century, so 1100s to Luther's Reformation time, there were groups of women living in community that were carrying out the roles of deaconess. So Belgium, Germany, and France, Netherlands, Switzerland. So again, as you see what they were doing, nursing, midwifery, caring for children, caring for the women of the church. So again, that really specific ministry. The needs of the church, the diaconate was meeting that. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you for that. So as the Protestant Reformation is happening and the convents and the monasteries are being closed, as we all know, the deaconess movement really reemerges in certain parts of Europe, and a bunch of smaller groups start in these new churches, and there are vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and service to the poor. And the deaconess is out in the community and is not just in the cloister. Whew, I was nervous. I did it. So the modern deaconess movement began in the 19th century. There was a real notice that there was a lot of care needed for women who, especially during the Industrial Revolution, were sort of being ignored by society. They didn't have jobs. Oftentimes they were in prison and coming out of prison. And so the Fliedners opened a deaconess mother house in Kaiserswerth, which is in Germany, and most famously for many people who are around, Florence Nightingale went to school there and learned her nursing training, and so these deaconesses were trained as nurses. And here you see some of these first deaconesses as well as Theodore Fliedner, who was a pastor.
And thank heavens we don't wear that garb anymore, because that would
Right.
turn me off right there. Sorry.
Right, because they're very serious about starching their hats and their bonnets and their scarves, which I can't iron. So I iron wrinkles into garments, not out. So the deaconess movement keeps spreading in Switzerland and France and Strasbourg, and all of these deaconess movements are still alive and active today, especially in hospitals and old age care and spiritual activities. Many of them have a hotel associated, so you can actually go and stay there. So it's kind of cool. I've stayed in the one by Paris. So here you see some more pictures of some of those early deaconesses. And so at the time, these deaconesses couldn't be married either, and really were sort of run by the institution. And it was kind of a serious matter, because they were doing really serious care of God's people who were hurting and in need. So they were doing some just amazing ministry that I have a hard time imagining. Then the deaconess movement comes to the United States in I'm supposed to turn this over to Deb now.
It's okay. You're on a roll. It was fine. It was fine. We're interchangeable. So in 1848, there's Pastor William Passavant, so in the Pennsylvania area, brought some of the deaconesses that had been trained at Kaiserswerth over to start a deaconess hospital outside of Pittsburgh, yes?
So there was Pittsburgh and Philadelphia.
Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, yeah. I think he was the it does say Pittsburgh, if I had read my notes. Yeah, there you go, sorry. And then also then in Philadelphia area, again, brought deaconesses over from Germany. So that really was kind of the gold standard for diaconal ministry. And again, because they were trained as both nurses and trained theologically, they had that ability to do both spiritual care of patients as well as physical care. And so many of the U.S. cities, even still today, you will see deaconess hospital at different places, and those more than likely were started back in those times by deaconesses, doctors, pastors that brought deaconesses from Germany. So by 1889, there were Lutheran, Episcopal, and Methodist denominations that were consecrating deaconesses. So this was really a time that was ripe for this movement to happen. Again, meeting social needs of the country, because this, again, Industrial Revolution, and lots of more awareness of social needs. So for the poor, for orphans, things were starting to improve a little bit with that, from the workhouse, poorhouse model to actually providing care for people and creating institutions to do that.
So right now, there are 3 Lutheran Deaconess communities in the United States. And the Lutheran Deaconess Conference, which are deaconesses trained by the LDA, which is us. And we started as part of the General Synodical Conference, and then were the official training of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. But over the years, especially in 1969, when the Missouri Synod had fellowship with the ALC, some of our deaconesses started serving in other churches that weren't from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And so today we have people from 8 different Lutheran church bodies who are a part of us. And until 1980, we were the sole training body for the LCMS, and our deaconesses served in many contexts and not just congregations. The Concordia Deaconess Conference, which some of you might also be familiar with, was formed in 1980 at Concordia, Chicago. And those are strictly LCMS-trained deaconesses who do not hold membership in any other deaconess community. They are a rostered office, and they, when you graduate from that program, you have to be into a called position at a congregation or an RSO or mission work. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America also has a deaconess community, which was formed as a merger from 3 mother houses, and they are recognized as a rostered office of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So they were some of those 1886, 95 groups on the previous slide. Oh, see? I forget that part. So we were started by Dr. Philip Wamsgans, was one of our originators, and his mom had been one of those Kaiserswerth Mother House deaconesses who came from Germany, and he remembered his mom talking about the important work that she did as a deaconess. And when she came, she was only here for a short time until she married a pastor. And once you were married, you were no longer a deaconess in those days. And so, but he remembered her stories of ministry that she would do. And he said, our church, our world, the United States, needs more deaconesses like this. If you are a history buff of baseball, you might recognize the name Wamsgans. In 1920, a infielder for the Cleveland Indians with the last name Wamsgans turned the only unassisted triple play in World Series history. Just a little side history note. And at that time, our nursing training program was in Fort Wayne at a hospital, and we trained women for about 20 years through a mother house system. We also had training in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, Watertown, Wisconsin, and Hot Springs, South Dakota. And one thing I never really knew until just really recently was we actually had our own hospital. This was in Wisconsin, and this is our first deaconess, Ina Kempf, who went and, this is her, ran the Lutheran Deaconess Hospital in Wisconsin. Here are some of our other deaconesses who maybe some of you have heard of before, but Deaconess Martha Eber and Deaconess Martha Boss are 2 sort of giants in our deaconess community. Martha Boss served in China and was on one of the last flights out during the communist takeover. And the Board for Missions ordered her to return to the United States, but she did not. She went as far as Hong Kong, where many of the refugees were fleeing. And so Martha served there for the rest of her life, which was sadly cut short in an automobile accident when she was back in the United States. But the community center and some of the schools that are run by the Hong Kong Lutheran Church are named after her. So the Martha Boss Community Center. Martha Eber was a deaconess who served in congregations in New York City, and she was about this tall. And I still remember going to visit her in New York City, and she would wear her deaconess uniform, and she would just march around the streets. There's actually a letter in her file from her pastor saying, please help us stop her in her 90s from marching around the streets of New York City, because it was not a really safe neighborhood where she was wandering about. And we had deaconesses like Louise who served all over the world at that time and were sent out as missionaries. So we were sending people around the world, as well as serving on Indian reservations in the Southwest and in the inner cities with immigrants who were coming in. Here is some of those early buildings that we had. You'll see the Mother House, our training school in Watertown, Beaver Dam, Hot Springs, South Dakota, which was actually a sanitarium, and then the hospital in Fort Wayne.
Take a break. So in 1943, the Fort Wayne Hospital and the Wisconsin Hospital decided that they were going to sell their property, so we were not going to have a place to have our mother house. So Valparaiso University very kindly offered us some space there. So in 1943, the training program moved to Valparaiso University in Indiana. And soon after that, in conjunction with the university, it became a 4-year bachelor's degree. So instead of that 1-year nursing and kind of theological training, this was a full 4 years. Again, a degree in both nursing and theology, right? It was a dual thing.
You could just study theology too.
Okay, you didn't have to do the nursing. Okay. In 1957, the LCMS started doing placements. So the College of Presidents would place first call deaconesses in various places. Again, for the most part, congregations, but also institutions that were doing social services and those kinds of things. So, and then they did that up until the deaconess program was formed in 1980 for the Concordia deaconesses. So Deaconess Hall, which Lisa can tell you a few more stories about, that was actually located on the property of Valparaiso, but was owned by the deaconesses, correct?
It was our property.
Oh, it was your property. Okay, sorry. I've only been consecrated since 2008. She's got the whole story. But anyhow, so deaconesses again. Yeah, Shirley lived there. There you go. That's right. Shirley's got some stories. But deaconesses lived in community. They ate and studied and served and worked together. It was a dormitory, but then also had a chapel and other things there. So again, that community piece was super important to the training, and has continued to today. It looks a little bit different than it did because we don't live together anymore in college. But Deaconess Hall was kind of the seat of where things happened at Valparaiso. Yep.
So if you happen to be an LWMLer, we received a $60,000 grant at the 55 convention. That was the first convention in Portland, and to help build Deaconess Hall. So if you think about, that long ago, $60,000 is a lot of money.
I'm going to let you.
Oh,
say this
whoops.
next piece.
Sorry. Oh, So in 1986, we got rid of Deaconess Hall and we moved to our new building, which was new to us. It used to be the Dean of the Chapel's home. And we started then a formation option for non-traditional, non-residential students. One of the people who came to be one of the first students in that program was a deaconess named Addie Wilkins. And Addie lived in the inner city of St. Louis with her kids. And she worked nonstop at Transfiguration Lutheran Church in St. Louis and was just the most wonderful woman. And so this made it possible, this program, for her to be a deaconess, that she didn't have to come to Valpo and do all the extensive theological training. And she did amazing programs to help get women and girls in particular help them move out of the projects that they were living in. And she did this great series of tapes called Here's Hope, Girlfriend, and that were just beautiful. Then in '04, we continued to change our education and formation process to make it look like what it does today.
So the need was, again, for people like me who were coming in. I was actually part of that first class of the new design. Not old, but older, had little kids at home, couldn't go to the seminary for 3 years and get another degree. My husband probably would have frowned upon that if I did that and left my children with him. But felt the call to diaconal service. So now all of our students, whether they are college-age kids coming through Valparaiso or second career or third career or fourth career, women who are, have always wanted to be a deaconess or always felt that call, we're all considered distance students. So we have the center where students will come for a week every summertime. Robin's getting information here. For an intensive seminar, but the rest of it is done locally in your congregation, in your setting. We individualize the program to fit the needs of the person with what they're bringing in. There's the basic requirements, but we have flexibility in how we do that. So it really can work for anybody in any setting. It should not be a barrier to anybody that's interested in that. Our flexibility and adaptability is one of our hallmarks, and we do that in lots of different ways. You'll hear a little bit about that in some of our stories here that we're going to tell. So at this moment, I'm going to stop. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I do have a
Yep.
comment or question. Do you then have any, like, basic, I don't want to say job responsibilities, but basic areas where a deacon or deaconess helps the church? I know it's probably specific to the church.
Right.
The basic foundation of what would be needed in a deaconess or deacon in order to carry out their work.
Sure. So I actually served a parish for 14 years in the Delaware area, and some of my things were confirmation, adult education. I did a lot of administration as far as helping the different committees and groups in the church carry out their functions. So I didn't necessarily run them, but like how do we make sure that everybody's on the same page with our mission and vision? I also did a whole lot with women's ministry, so retreats, workshops, spiritual care. I did pastoral visits at the hospital, really kind of anything. Again, you're exactly right. It's the needs of the congregation that really dictate that. There aren't prescribed roles. It's really whatever the congregation needs. So we have women that do assist with worship, if that's something that a congregation wants, but if that's not what is needed in a congregation, not how they're set up, then you don't. It's really designed to however.
So like in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod,
That's what we are.
That was the LCMS church, yep.
okay,
Yep.
so can a deacon or deaconess administer the sacrament?
So it depends on the congregation.
Okay.
So the congregation I belong to, but I am not the deaconess at, we had women who served the wine. The pastor served the bread.
Okay, and
And
what
so-
about in a case where a person is ill?
So, people who are doing there's a lot of deaconesses who do hospital visitation or shut-ins and things like that. And if the congregation is okay with that, then the deaconess will serve communion. So there's some congregations that say, no, it's just the pastor or just the elders that should do that. There are other congregations who are like, no, our deaconess can do that as well.
Okay.
So that's one of the things. Like we have a deaconess at the church I belong to in Valparaiso, and she did the food pantry, the women's ministry. She also did small group ministry because it's a pretty large congregation, and she would get to know every single new member and find out what their gifts were and then plug them into a small group. And so what I love about a deaconess or deacon is that, like, DCEs are awesome, but, you know, their primary training is around education, whereas I think we're trained a little bit more broadly than a DCE is, in my opinion.
I would concur. This is you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad to help. So in 2012, the LDA began training and forming men as well. And so in 2018, we officially changed our name from the Lutheran Deaconess Association to the Lutheran Diaconate Association because, well, it was kind of awkward for the men to be part of the Lutheran Deaconess Association. And in 2019, we celebrated our centennial. And so the men who are coming into the program are people like Deacon Steve Arnold. Steve served here for many years as a DCE, and he ran the DCE program at Concordia St. Paul for like 25, 30 years. But he always wanted to be part of a community of caring and loving and nurturing and encouraging and supporting men. And so he came to the LDA, and he was basically retired when he came to the LDA to be a deacon.
So this sort of addresses a little bit more of your question. So in our definition of what a Lutheran deaconess or deacon is, so it's someone that feels that call to serve Christ, not necessarily the call to the pastorate, which is a different call than a deaconess or a deacon is called to, obviously in the LCMS that's also a different thing. So we have theological training, we have pastoral care training. Our students take a unit of clinical pastoral education, so how to do chaplaincy, whether that's in a hospital, with the homeless, in a prison, lots of different settings. And we also have practical ministry training. So our students also do a 9-month fieldwork experience, which is a volunteer something. We help them figure out what that is, and then they do a year-long internship, whether that's what their current job or ministry is, and we help them view that with a diaconal lens. Like, what does it mean to be a deaconess social worker? What does it mean to be a deaconess engineer or a deacon nurse or that kind of thing? Or sometimes students are looking for something new and different. So we will help them find a placement to try out something new, that are gifts that maybe have emerged in their training that they are trying to nurture. Again, that community piece. So we do not base our membership, if you want to call it that, in community upon your call. So even if you're not you do not have a call to a church, most of our folks are not rostered people, so they don't have a call. You're still part of the community. So it's not based on your job or where you're serving. It's by virtue of you have gone through, you have made these promises, you are consecrated into our community. That never goes away. Before, as Lisa said, when you got married, when women got married, they actually had to leave the community. Fortunately, that has changed over the years, and we've gone and invited many of those people back to be part of community.
Did you have to leave when you got married?
No.
No?
But I
Okay.
had a call.
Right.
Yeah, so that's changed a little bit. Right. And again, that whole idea of serving Christ in the way the world needs. So obviously we need pastors and church workers to work in our congregations. I think there's at least in our district, I know that I think there's 34 vacancies right now, and growing. So clearly we need those people to be trained and work there, but we also need people out in the community that are boots on the ground, getting to know people around and serving those needs in ways that church workers can't always do because they're busy doing the work of the congregation, the building, the facility, the institution.
I'm just asking.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
But, in a church then, when you said the church decides what type of work their deacon or deaconess would do, who generally in the church decides? Is it the core, like church council, and
Mm-hmm.
the elders, the pastor? They
Yep.
get together and say, okay, what is our need and how are we going to define this position's responsibility?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And a lot of times, depending on the congregation and how your governance is set up, that may require a congregational meeting or a vote to create a position. Sometimes it doesn't, but congregations differ. But typically, it either will come from the elders or the pastor to say, hey, I know somebody that's interested, or here's something we need. We get phone calls at the center that say, hey, I need somebody that's particularly got this kind of training or ministry. Do you know anybody? And then we'll advertise it out to our community. But yeah, it typically arises from the elders or pastor or board of trustees, however you set
And
up.
we also like to just say to pastors that it's kind of important to have a woman on staff who is trained to do, because there's certain things that happen in women's lives that you really want to talk to a woman about, and maybe you don't necessarily want to talk to a man about it, but a woman who is trained in listening and theological and things like that.
Can you all speak to, is there any overlap, looking at that pastoral care piece, between that and Stephen ministry?
We actually have a deaconess who works in the Stephen ministry office. So we think Stephen ministry, I think
go
Stephen
ahead.
ministry is awesome training for a deaconess, because the kinds of skills you learn there is exactly what we're talking about. Some of those listening skills, having that care receiver, those kinds of things. Stephen ministry is
Yeah, so I would say there is probably some overlap just in the basic theology and philosophy of spiritual care. Stephen Ministry obviously is its own separate training program that people go through, but it's complementary. I mean, it's essential, and many of our deaconesses and deacons too are Stephen ministers and vice versa. So. Oh, I'm like, did that change? Okay, sorry. Blah, blah, blah. So LDA trained deaconesses and deacons differ from those that have gone through the LCMS program in that our training does not lead to rostering, which for some people is important. They want to be on that roster and eligible for a called position to a congregation. But congregations do not have to have a called position to have a deaconess or deacon. They can create a job, and it can be a contract sort of position. So I actually was rostered through a different line, through lay ministry. So I actually had a call, but several of my sister deaconesses who serve in congregations don't have a call. It was just, we have this need. We know some folks who have been trained, and they created a position and created a contract, sort of a position. So there's the LCMS program through the Concordias, which is a master's degree program, 3 years, I believe. And so if that's the kind of thing that someone is looking for, then their program is a great fit for that. They also are several districts that have lay deacon programs, which are similar to ours but are not as in-depth. So typically the classes are about 4 weeks each. We require a college level, bachelor's degree level coursework. They don't require pastoral chaplaincy training. They'll do, a 4-week class about that. And so most lay deacons, at least I'm speaking for my district, I can't speak to other districts, are trained specifically, like here, again, like you said, here's a church that has a need, we need some people to have some training. So they'll send people to a lay deacon training program. So ours is just a little more in-depth, a little more of at a professional level, in the sense of the level that we require coursework and so forth. So our folks are trained in 4 areas: work ministry, spirituality, theology, and community. And if you want to know more about that, I certainly can talk about that after we're done. Once consecrated, you are a member of our community for life. So through the LCMS, also the ELCA and other church bodies, unless you have a call, you are not part of that community particularly. Once you leave a call, you are, just as if a pastor leaves a call, you're not technically a pastor. You can stay on the roster. Ours, it doesn't matter what your job is. you're part of our community. And since many of our folks now do not serve congregations, they serve in their own context. So Lisa's going to tell you some stories here in a minute about some of our people, but I can tell you about some of my students that I'm in charge of right now. We have someone that works for a veterans organization. She is actually their bookkeeper, and so you'd say, well, how in the world is that diaconal ministry? So she makes sure that the people that come into the center that need help or need information are greeted warmly, they're listened to, they're valued, their stories are heard. She said, sometimes I just spend all day sitting and listening to people I don't actually get my work done. But that's Christ-like service, right? You're meeting people where they are. We have a recently consecrated student who works for Imagination Stage in Washington, D.C. She is the director of development. And so we said, okay, so how do you do that with the diaconal ministry hat? So she noticed in D.C., of course, inner city, lots of kids. They were never going to have the money to go to a theater and see a show. So she created free programs for our city kids to come and see the shows that were being offered. Again, with some go-between with the teachers and the kids that were coming, so they felt comfortable and welcome in a place that maybe they had never been before, that kind of a place. So those are what I mean about meeting the needs where they are, not somebody that necessarily works in a congregation. All right, and now we got some stories. Lisa's a really good storyteller.
Most of their work is outside of the church building then versus.
Gosh, I don't know what I can't tell you the percentage anymore, but.
Community, seeking
Right.
going out,
Yep.
seeking,
Yep.
I don't want to say almost a social ministry, but attending
Right.
to the needs of the
Right.
people
Right.
and then bringing them in.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah.
times.
Well, we often talk about it's a bridge between the church and the community, as in the community where you live. So what are the needs that are going on in Mankato right now? And the deaconess or deacon would be paying attention, like, oh my gosh, this is happening at this school, or this is happening with this group of people in Mankato. How can I bring those needs back? One, so that we can pray for them, pray for, all of Mankato. And two, how can I find people in the church who will work with me to help out this group of people? Whether it's finding something at Mankato State or a shelter or food program, or, there's just this huge kind of thing. And so that's one of the things that we love, is sort of being that bridge, that go-between. So here's just some pictures of some deaconesses and deacons that I wanted to tell you about. Here in the green up at the top, that's Katie. Katie was worked first in a congregation, and then she worked at a seminary helping international students find their way and to be hospitable to them so that they would feel welcome in their classes. And now she's a mom. And that is her primary ministry. And because we're the LDA, and like Deb said, you don't have to be in a called position, we say being a mom is really kind of this most awesome thing that a deaconess can do. And so she now has 2 kids, not just 1. But so she's a mom. Edie, who is the woman in the blue and white stripe, Edie is more of a tradition. I'm going to call her the traditional deaconess. Edie worked her entire career in congregations, doing a huge variety of congregational ministries. So whatever the congregation needed, wherever they lived, because they moved a bit for her husband's work. And so Edie was there to fill that need and to serve those congregations in the different ways that was happening in their lives.
I lived in Christmas Hall.
Did you? Awesome. I was wondering about that.
To hear some stories.
Right? That'll be good. Ben, who's the lower left, Ben was our very first deacon. And Ben is a nurse. And when Ben started his nursing career, he was working on a med-surg floor at night. And the other nurses knew that he was also trained as a chaplain, as well as being an RN. And so often, if there was a patient who was upset, who was struggling with whatever was happening with them, that other nurses would team up and take Ben's other patients, and Ben would just sit with that patient who was struggling and having a hard time. And Ben's presence and love is just awesome. He then became an IV nurse, and I saw Ben with my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law had had a stroke, and Ben came to do her IV, and my mother-in-law was not the easiest woman. She had run a blood bank, so she knew, about needles and sticking people. And so I was nervous for Ben, but the way Ben was with her just brought tears to my eyes, the love and care that he showed for each person. It wasn't just about finding that vein. It was about making sure that people knew that they were a child of God that he cared about so much. Now Ben is a community nurse. He has his master's.
I believe that's correct.
I can't remember what exactly the program is called. And so he works in community nursing and still continues to carry out that loving, caring presence of God to people who are hurting. Sarah, who's in the middle, Sarah, when she was 14, became a professional ballerina, dancing with the Milwaukee Ballet Company and some other ballet companies. And Sarah came to Valparaiso University to study French. One day, she had a bunch of friends who were in the Deaconess program. One day she was riding her bike after dance class, and she ran over a dead squirrel, I think it was, with her bike. And so she was kind of freaked out, and so she came to the center, and her friends were so excited to welcome her in that she just was like, this is where I belong. And so Sarah became a Deaconess student. She did 2 internships, but her first internship was at one of those mother houses outside of Paris, where she worked in hospitality with people at the hotel that came, and also with people who were ill and seniors and those kinds of things. Then after graduation, Sarah worked at Good Shepherd Lutheran Home of the West, who maybe none of you have ever heard of, but they were bought out by Bethesda. They were basically Bethesda of the West Coast. And so she served as the chaplain in Colorado and did a lot with her people around movement and dance. And she became a liturgical dancer and taught at ILIF, which is a theological school in Colorado, and taught liturgical dance. And to see Sarah dance, the Bible story comes alive. I, in the past, had not been a huge fan of liturgical dance, but the way she can tell a story through her body movements is just amazing. So Sarah does not do as much, Sarah's 50, so is not doing as much ballet as she used to.
What do you say? For those of us over
Right?
50. What do you say?
For those of us over 50, it makes sense. The couple over here on the far right are Rebecca and Rodney. They live in Toledo, Ohio. Rebecca is a lawyer, and Rebecca worked with teenagers, and she was discovering that she was doing more ministry with those teenagers than she was doing really legal kind of work. She was being there, she was listening, she was drawing them out, she was counseling. And so Rebecca decided she wanted to have more training, and I found the LDA. So she's one of the people who looked at the Fort Wayne program and our program, but decided she wanted to continue being a lawyer, just adding those deaconess skills in. And so that's why the LDA's program fit her better than the Fort Wayne program would, as well as we were a distance program long before they were. So Rebecca today is a prosecutor, and Rebecca sits with people and works with them and works within the legal system to find out what is best to bring justice to a situation. Justice in a situation doesn't necessarily always mean incarceration, or it might mean being incarcerated into a special program where you're actually going to get the help you need when you're incarcerated. So Rebecca continues her ministry through her law practice. Her husband Rodney is a school teacher, and Rodney saw what Rebecca had, and Rodney came to some deaconess conferences and said, I want this. And so Rodney is currently a student in our men's community and continues to be a fourth grade teacher. Fifth grade teacher.
Toledo public school system, which is
I'm not going to be
a
graded.
difficult place to be a teacher these days.
So Rodney brings the love of Jesus into his classroom. Those community building exercises that he learns as part of being in a community with the LDA, that care that he has for each one of his kids to help them be the best people, recognizing that each one of them is loved so much by God. And so that's who Rodney and Rebecca are together, and very active in their Lutheran church as well. In fact, the church where Rebecca was consecrated, they fascinatingly enough had a deaconess from Fort Wayne and a Valparaiso deaconess who worked together and just worked together so beautifully. So those are just a couple stories. Shirley, would you be willing to tell your story?
I will.
Thank you.
It's long.
That's okay. It can be as long or short as you want.